Okay, Assalamu alaikum everyone, and I guess we'll get started with this event. There's a lot of hype behind this event, and I think reasonably so, and I think this is part of the reason why I wanted to do this event, is just sort of this whole notion around Farid and the state of polemics between Sunnis and Shias. I think one of the most important things here to note is that Farid has sort of gotten this big bad wolf status, right? Like, everyone looks at Farid and they're like, oh, you should debate Farid, and if you debate Farid and win, that means you've proved the Shias right? Or like sort of as if Farid is sort of the objective standard and the pinnacle of polemics today. And in reality, Farid is just some random guy, right? You know, he's, as we call him, Ganguteli, right? That's really all he is. And there's a lot of significance to this, and I wanted to sort of blow away this whole notion that he's this infallible sort of superhuman guy with like all this knowledge and whatnot. He's just a normal dude. He has his flaws in his methodology, and I wanted to sort of explain and expound on those flaws and talk about his methods. Okay, so now let's get right into the meat and potatoes of everything. Okay. Alright, so Farid's main claim here is that if you have a Sahih isnad, it's more useful, always, than a da'if one, and vice versa. So, this is Farid's own words.
Learning Islamic history is different than Western history. Alhamdulillah, we are blessed with asanid, we are blessed with eyewitness sources, we are blessed with information that will allow us to study these reports. We don't even need to put all different types and levels of analysis to reconcile between various contradicting, seemingly equal reports due to asanid. It really clears everything up.
Okay, so again, as he said, you know, if you use the isnad, you won't need to use these analytical tools, you won't need to use your rationality, your rhetoric. The isnad clears up contradictions for you. We'll explore this, but here's on to his second point, right?
And there's a statement by Sheikh Muqbil, beautiful statement, where he talks about history, and he says, especially in history, we need to focus on the rules of the muhaddithin. And the reason is because every single sect is going to pick and choose whatever they like and say, this is the truth. But, of course, if you apply hadith rules, then no, that's not going to happen. When you apply hadith rules, you're going to have an objective history and not a subjective history.
So, as Farid says, if we use the rules of the muhaddithin, if we follow sahih isnads, what will happen is we'll produce a objective view of history. And this is the main thing I want to tackle in this whole presentation, is this whole idea of we need to use sahih isnads. The only way we can believe in something is through a sahih isnad. The only way we can be objective is through a sahih isnad. This is my whole contention with Farid in this whole discussion. And the reason why is because, you know, nowadays when we're discussing with Sunnis, what we try to do is we always try to, you know, pin them on this. We always try to pin them on their own Rijal, right? We always try to say, look, this is Sahih by your standards, therefore you have to accept it. We always try to wiggle around and try to find and justify everything by their standards, by their point of view, by their Rijal. And it's a losing game for us because it's rigged against us. Their Rijal system is ultimately what, as I will explain, very subjective, is very circular, and it's rigged in such a way that any hadith that's Sahih will necessarily support their views, will necessarily support their perspective, their point of view, and anything that's da'if will not, right? So this is the whole point that I'm trying to get across, is that we shouldn't be playing into this game, we shouldn't be buying into this whole Sahih or go home. We should be using some other tools, some other methodologies. We should be thinking about things more deeply. So first and foremost, we should recognize that Farid himself, he's not consistent to his own views. In fact, he dances around the quote-unquote these infallible rules of the muhaddithin which produce quote-unquote objective history, he dances around them himself, right? So for example, when it comes to the event of Fatimiyyah, he likes to play around with this whole notion of Aslam, this mursal tradition of Aslam, in which a hadith is narrated that Umar threatened to burn down the house of Fatima alayhi salam. And Farid says this is a disconnected mursal tradition and therefore it should be rejected. Now here's the thing, in this whole presentation, we're not going to be completely focusing on hadith and, all these Rijal rules and whatnot. We're going to be discussing about the rhetoric of all this, right? So this is just going to be a little bit of a segue, but just here's an example of him contradicting his own standards and his own views. So here, as I was explaining, this is his view about Aslam.
Here we have a report going to Aslam, the Mawla of Umar, and Aslam, the Mawla of Umar, was not an eyewitness, and therefore the report is disconnected.
But here, on the other hand, so while he claims that, look, the narration of Aslam to the Prophet, the narration of Aslam to events after the Prophet's death is disconnected, here we have Bukhari, who is considered widely by Sunnis to be the pinnacle standard of what should be a Sahih Hadith. Here we have Bukhari narrating directly from Aslam without any intermediary. So, as we know, here Bukhari considered this connection to be Sahih. He considered it to be muttasil, connected. So, Farid here is actually bringing up a critique that Daraqutni brings up, and that is that the chain beginning with Aslam is disconnected. So, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the author of Fath al-Bari, in fact, the most important commentator on Bukhari, one of the biggest and most preeminent scholars of Rijal in Sunni history, he explains, look, we know that this narration of Aslam is not disconnected because we know that Aslam has met Umar, and the narration says Umar has said, and therefore it's connected. So here's the thing: it's definitely agreed upon within the methodology of the Sunni scholars that, look, narrating from Aslam is fine, right? We have two narrations here in Tirmidhi right here that I have up on the screen, where Aslam is narrating directly to the Prophet, even without saying, right here as we mentioned, even without saying from Umar in it, right? Even without the statement, Tirmidhi accepted it, and it's Sahih, right? Even in Muwatta Malik, we have even a step further than that, and that is that, look, Malik is relying on the mursal of Zayd bin Aslam. In other words, 2 steps removed. So even Malik is accepting these things. Even Tirmidhi is accepting these things. Even Suyuti accepts this. Bukhari accepts this. Now, here's the thing. Is Farid saying, I want to reject their methodologies? Why is he rejecting their methodologies, right? Is he rejecting their methodologies because he thinks they're wrong? And if so, look, he's no longer applying the rules of the muhaddithin as he has explained, as these are the ways of achieving objectivity. He's no longer relying on them. So even still, Farid claims that, look, the reason why Daraqutni makes the critique and says that the hadith is sahih from Aslam is because, look, it comes to us from a different chain. So here we have a mursal, quote-unquote, hadith in Bukhari from Urwa, right? And in this hadith, Urwa is being narrated from, without an intermediary, to the Prophet. And this is a problem, right? However, we note Ibn Hajar's words. He says, if the narrator has met the person he narrates from, and he is not a deceiver, he's not a liar, he's thiqa, it is considered as if he has heard from the one he reports from. So, no matter where Farid turns, he cannot run away from this idea that Aslam is a connected narration to the Prophet, is a connected narration to the events after the Prophet. He can't run away from this. So, it's very clear here that he's not really being consistent, even to his own standards. So, with that out of the way, I wanted to start discussing about, this whole idea of, is a Sahih chain even objective in the first place, right? Like, where did this idea come from that if you follow the Sahih chains, you will produce objectivity? Where does this idea come from? And first of all, and not only that, but is that even a correct claim to make that if you have a Sahih chain, it will be objective? So recall Farid's notions that, look.
And there's a statement by Sheikh Muqbil, beautiful statement, where he talks about history, and he says, especially in history, we need to focus on the rules of the muhaddithin. And the reason is because every single sect is going to pick and choose whatever they like and say, this is the truth. But of course, if you apply hadith rules, then no, that's not going to happen. When you apply hadith rules, you're going to have an objective history and not a subjective history.
So let's think very carefully here for a second, right? He's saying, look, if we apply the hadith rules, if we want to rely on the authentic narrations, we'll produce objectivity. But let's think about this very carefully. What makes a hadith sahih or da'if? The isnad, right? And what is the isnad based on? It's based on the rijali interpretations of people. So whether or not each person in the chain is considered authentic or inauthentic, and what opinions people had of them. So here's my contention, right? If we find evidence that narrators in Sunni Rijal are being weakened because they had Shia beliefs, Shia tendencies, then saying that Sahih chains are objective becomes circular logic. Why? Because look, you're saying this report is Sahih, and it's Sahih because these people believe what I want them to believe, right? So it's circular logic. So Michael Dan, in his book, Contested Boundaries, Reception of Shia Narrators in Sunni Hadith, he says, applying this method to our three categories of Shias, Rafidis and Shia Rafidis, we find that four major characteristics were distributed in uneven proportions across all three groups of narrators. Number one, pay attention to this very carefully. Number one, narrating the virtues, the fada'il of Ali and the Ahlul Bayt. So narrating fada'il of Ali and the Ahlul Bayt. And number two, criticizing the companions. So these two are very important. He continues by saying the average grade received by Shias, meaning people who either A, narrated the virtues of Ali and the Ahlul Bayt excessively, or what they deemed to be excessively, their grading was 5.9. And what this means is that they were not trustworthy by Sunni standards. The average grade for Rafidis, people who criticized the companions, was a 3.1, which is da'if. So, in other words, we have evidence that, look, narrators are being weakened because they had pro-Shia tendencies, and therefore, Sahih chains are circular logic. To say that this produces objectivity is circular. Let's look at, for example, the case of Abu Mikhnaf, right? Even if you accept, for example, that your Rijal decisions are objective, the other thing is, how do you even decide between two conflicting opinions on someone? So, for example, the case of Abu Mikhnaf, Lut bin Yahya, he is a prominent historian used by Sunnis and Shias, right? Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the author of Fath al-Bari, the commentator of Bukhari, he accepts his historical reports. Dhahabi, on the other hand, he says, no, he's an extremist Shia. Why should we accept his reports? Now, here's the thing. What standards are we using to pick between these, right? Are we using a textual standard? Are we using an objective standard? Or no? Or are we using some intellectual standard, some subjective standard to pick between which of these opinions we should take or not, right? Here's another subjective Rijali decision. We have, for example, Daraqutni, the criticizer of Bukhari, the person who commentated on Bukhari and corrected many of its contents. He rejects, for example, a narrator in Bukhari, Imran bin Hittan, on the account of him being a Nasibi. Whereas on the other hand, Bukhari, he accepts him. So look, what standards are we using, right? How do we know, for example, that nasb is something that should be rejected, and how do we know that nasb is something that should not be rejected, right? These are all, subjective standards. They're subjective. And we have this quote here. Daraqutni rejects Imran bin Hittan because as an adult he supported the Kharijis and even praised Ali's murderer in a poem, right? And Bukhari accepts this. Bukhari says this is fine. So where is this idea of like, we have to, if these narrators are good, if these narrators are agreed upon, they're sahih, they're this and this, therefore the chain is sahih and therefore this is subjective. No, look, even people disagree on these narrators. They're saying people have different opinions as to how significant nasb is. Whereas the Shia would say, look, he's a khariji. He's praising Ibn Muljam. Why should we accept him? Whereas Bukhari says, no, this is not a problem, right? We'll take it. Here we even have cases where people are even deviating from the rules of muhaddithin. So one of the rules of hadith is that if a hadith has tadlis in it, meaning that one of the narrators in the chain has been hidden away. So for example, if I say, let's say I heard from Silverado, from Abu Hadi, that Mr. Lenient said something, right? Like, this is the chain. And instead I say, I heard Mr. Lenient say, I'm doing tadlis, meaning I'm concealing where I'm hearing this from. Now, Ibn Hibban, one of the commentators of the 6 books of the Sunnis, he notes that, look, we accepted tadlis from all of the Sahaba of the Prophet. So as long as they narrated from the Prophet, we just accepted their tadlis. It was fine, right? So even in this case, even the muhaddithin are deviating from their own rules for subjective reasons, right? So, and we have even more examples of this. So for example, Ibn Hibban, again, he comments about this connection between Hassan al-Basri and Ibn Abbas, right? And we have 3 different interpretations as to why or how this apparently this narration which has tadlis in it, which is disconnected, it's mursal, how it's connected. So Bukhari gives one explanation, Ibn Abi Hatim gives another explanation, and Tirmidhi gives another explanation altogether. So this is all just a subjective game as to, how are we going to justify that this narration is connected? How are we going to justify that this narration is coherent, right? Again, it's all different opinions people have. So there's none of this notion of, if this hadith is sahih. Sure, Ibn Abi Hatim, Bukhari, Tirmidhi, they agree that this hadith is sahih, but they're disagreeing as to why it's sahih. So how can you say that it's objective at all? And again, if these muhaddithin were truly so objective, right, to their hadith rules, Ibn Abi Hatim, Ibn Hibban notes, look, there would be simply no hadith left, right? Because everyone did tadlis back in the day. All of these sahabi did tadlis. And in fact, many people, made up isnads, paraphrased hadith, made mistakes, all of this. And Ibn Hibban says, like, yeah, people did this, but, we should accept them because they're the Sahaba. So there's clearly some very subjectivity going on. There's a lot of calculation. There's a lot of sense of like, I'm accepting this for this reason or this reason. So back to the point here, right here, where we note that criticizing some of the companions of the Prophet will get you a weak grading. You'll be put into the camp of al-Rafidi, and you'll be given a very weak grading. So back to this point. So note how we were saying, look, Farid's saying, look, if we apply the hadith rules, we'll have an objective history. So what are your hadith rules based on? They're based on your Rijal. So what is your Rijal based on? Your Rijal is based on if you adhere to these doctrines of belief. So if you criticize the companions, you will be weakened. So where is this notion of criticizing the companions coming from? Is this an objective standard or is this subjective standard? So there's 2 ways in which criticizing the companions is a subjective standard. Number 1, I'll call it inherent, and number 2, I'll call it interpretive. I'll explain both of these. But in either of these 2 cases, Farid's, quote-unquote Sahih history necessarily presupposes a Sunni narrative. He necessarily is presupposing, he's assuming Sunni beliefs before he's talking about whether or not this is sahih or da'if. He's assuming this, right? And the reason why he's assuming this is because he's assuming Adalat al-Sahaba, that should not be violated, right? So we have this narration of Ibn Hanbal that Eaton Kohlberg talks about in Praise of the Few, where, whenever someone talked anything bad about the Sahaba, what would he do? He would stick his fingers in his ears, he would go, la 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 la, I can't hear you, and he would walk away, right? So, where is this coming from, right? Where is this whole idea that you should not narrate anything bad about the Sahaba? You shouldn't even talk bad about them. You should never ascribe anything bad about them. So where is this coming from? So Sunnis, for example, will say, look, we have these verses in the Quran that talk about this. We have 9-100, we have 9-40, 3-110, you are the best of nations. 9-100 was like the foremost and the forerunners of the Muhajirun and the Ansar and those who followed them in goodness. Allah is pleased with them and they are pleased with Allah, etc., etc., etc. The question is, are these really just objective standards? Are they actually standards that are infallible and inviolable? The reality is, look, there's inherently some textual ambiguity, right? There's some issues of scope here, right? So for example, with 9-100, we have the foremost and the forerunners of the Muhajirun and the Ansar, right? Who are these people? How many people are included in them? Is Abu Bakr in them? Is Imam Ali in them, right? We have two separate strands of narrations, for example. One says Imam Ali was the first person to convert, and one says Abu Bakr was the first person to convert. So which one are we going to be taking, right? If we're taking the foremost and the forerunners of the Muhajirun and the Ansar, if Ali comes first or if Abu Bakr comes first, it means something. It's a big difference. And secondly, what's the scope of it? How many people includes the forerunners and the foremost? So these are all very subjective. They're very, they're not definitive. They're not 100% objective. You still have to provide some extra evidence on top of these verses in order to prove this idea of Adalat al-Sahaba in the first place. So it's definitely subjective, right? And again, Sunnis also will claim, look, we have Hadith, do not insult my companions, or for example, when it comes to the disagreements among my companions, refrain, or for example, my companions are like stars, follow any one of them and you will be guided. Look, even this is circular logic, right? Because you're using Hadith to prove Adalat al-Sahaba, which proves Adalat al-Sahaba, which proves the probity of your Hadiths, and if you're using Adalat al-Sahaba to prove that your Hadiths are valid, which prove Adalat al-Sahaba, it's circular logic, right? So, again, what I'm saying is no objective standard definitively proves that Adalat al-Sahaba is an inviolable doctrine, and therefore weakening someone for it is subjective. You're basing it off of your speculation, your reasoning. And look, if you're weakening someone for criticizing the companions, you're presuming this, you're assuming this. It's something you're taking for granted. It is a subjective standard. The other thing about Adalat al-Sahaba is the interpretive subjectivity. What do I mean by this? So, because people presuppose Adalat al-Sahaba, anything that happens, so for example, the Battle of Jamal, or the Battle of Siffin, or anything Muawiyah does, they're all going to be presumed to be, what? They're all going to be presumed to be acting in the right way. They're all going to be presumed to be acting according to what they think is correct. They're all going to be forgiven and excused from any harm or any actions. So everything is interpreted in a favorable light for these people. So for example, Ash'ari theologians, they all said that, look, all the companions, all the Sahaba were mujtahidun, meaning that, look, they were adil, and they possessed legal knowledge, and they were good Muslims. And there's a hadith that says, if a mujtahid arrives at the correct conclusion, he will receive 2 rewards. And if he errs, he will receive 1 reward. Meaning what? No matter what he does, he's on the right path. It doesn't matter what he does. And look, we have this inherent subjectivity very distinctly proven within Sunni Hadith. Look at the following narration from Sahih Muslim. It's in this chapter called, whoever is cursed by the Prophet and he doesn't deserve it, it will be purification and reward for him. So look, here's a hadith where the Prophet is cursing Muawiyah. Muawiyah is being tardy, he's being slow in listening to the command of the Prophet, so the Prophet curses him. And look, by Muslim putting this hadith in this chapter, what he means is that, look, he necessarily has good views of Muawiyah. He necessarily believes that he's undeserving of criticism. he necessarily thinks that he has good thoughts of him. So what? He's interpreting how he looks at this hadith in terms of his Adalat to Sahaba. It doesn't mean that, this hadith objectively is, it objectively shows that the Prophet undeservingly criticized and cursed Muawiyah. The hadith doesn't even indicate that. Rather, Muslim imposed that view and that interpretation onto this hadith, and therefore he is interpreting it in a good way. So again, we have this quote from Abu Hanifa where it says, the view of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is to test all the honor and the integrity of all the companions, to praise them as Allah, just as Allah has praised them, and whatever occurred between Ali and Muawiyah is just from ijtihad, right? Whatever it was, they were both on the right path. So look, to recap, Farid claims that if we follow these Sahih chains, we will end up with objectivity. But look, a chain is only Sahih if all of the narrators ascribe to Sunni doctrines and do not mention bad about the Sahaba. So how is it an accident then that, of course, the Sahih reports that Farid uses line up with his narrative? Because the reason why they're Sahih is because the people who are narrating them believe in this narrative in the first place. So of course it's going to line up. Of course it's going to match up. Of course it's going to be objective to his standards. Of course it's going to be like that. It's not an accident. The narrative was presupposed. That's how he ends up with his narrative when he follows Sahih Hadith. So the next thing I want to talk about is sort of Farid's, I guess, quote-unquote, misunderstanding of what history even is in the first place, right? And to this, I think this is where he really shows a lot of his ignorance when it comes to history, right? He's good with hadith, he's good with rijal, he's good with, hadith science. He's good with all these things. But if there's one thing he isn't, he's not a historian. He's certainly not a historian. And he certainly hasn't read anything about, the philosophy of history. He certainly doesn't know anything about the rhetoric of history. And we'll explain, and we'll make this very clear in just a little bit, right? Let me take a drink of water. So what is history, right? Can it ever be objective? So first and foremost, history isn't simply what happened objectively, right? So as we explained with the Muawiyah example, it's not just that hadith that we're talking about. We're also talking about how it's interpreted. So Muslim will take that and mean, look, this is the Prophet praising Muawiyah because he cursed him undeservingly. Whereas a Shia, on the other hand, would say, look, this is Muawiyah acting like a fasiq, right? He's acting misguided. So there's two different interpretations to one thing that people agree upon. There's always a level of interpretation involved, and interpretation is inherently subjective. The other question we have to ask is, look, can we only rely on hadiths for history, right? What about other evidences? Like, for example, one of the evidences used against the Fatimiyyah is that doors didn't exist back in Arabia. The people had palm fronds. So there's no hadith explicitly saying that their door was a palm frond or their door was a door, right? Rather, we have evidence that says, look, people used palm fronds instead of doors back then. So this is evidence that maybe some details about the Fatimiyyah have been maybe fabricated or later on additions or exaggerations per se, right? I'm not saying where I'm going to deny the whole Fatimiyyah. I'm just saying, look, maybe these details can be disputed for things outside of the hadiths in history. The second thing is, look, can we only rely on Sahih hadiths for history? Look, Farid's claims is that, look, we should only rely on Sahih isnads, and this clears up all the contradictions. This clears up all what we need to know about history. So I wanna briefly play a clip, and it'll explain a quote, which I'll explain in a second, right?
Well, there's a quote here by Marshall Hodgson. I'm not going to read all of it, but basically what Marshall Hodgson says, the famous historian, is that the events that occurred after the death of the Prophet were as important as the events during the life of the Prophet himself. Because Muslims ended up basically constructing their frames of reference or interpreting the past through what happened after the death of the Prophet. So there's a whole history of symbolism that's derived from the events and leading personalities and what they did or did not do after the death of the Prophet, right? And I think this is a very profound statement by Hodgson in the Venture of Islam.
So the takeaway from that quotation is, look, do reports come out of thin air? So for example, when we were talking about the Fatimiyyah, does that come out of thin air? Did someone just randomly invent that out of willy-nilly? Especially considering, look, there are many early reports. Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, for example, is an early source that attests to this. And it's quite early. In fact, it's contemporary to, I believe, Imam Rada, for example. Right? It's contemporary to him. So these are early sources that are talking about this. So are these hadith of Umar and Fatima having an altercation, are they just coming out of nowhere? Or do they have a real base and later on people add things or change things or come up with some sort of mythology or narrative out of them? Which one is the case? Farid, the way I take it, I think what he's saying is, look, these reports do come out of thin air. They're completely fabrications. They have no real base. There's nothing about them that's real. So here's the thing: before we even begin to talk about and address all these points, we have to sort of discuss what even is objectivity in the first place. Because this is also another failing that Farid has, is that he doesn't really understand what standards we're using in history. What is objectivity? And that's the thing, right? The answer to that, no one knows. No one knows what objectivity is. Everything, for all we know, is quite subjective when it comes to life and things that we're going through. So, for example, it's pretty well known on the server that I'm going to law school, right? But how do you know that I'm not lying, right? But probably the easiest evidence is, look, what I'm saying is coherent. What I'm saying is cohesive. The things that I say, the things that I act like, the things that I do, these are all lining up in such a way that I probably am not lying. But at the same time, there's always that room for doubt, right? You can always say that maybe he's just lying about all of these things. Maybe he's such a really good liar that he's coherent about everything. So what we call this is a Bayesian inference, meaning that how we adjust our perceptions of beliefs and things. So for example, the earth is round, we adjust our perception of whether or not we believe in that based on tiny pieces of evidence adding up and adding up and adding up. And all of these little pieces of evidence, they come together and they form a whole picture. They form a whole view. Unlike how Farid is saying, look, we need one Sahih narration, and if we look at these one individual narrations, we'll get the picture. No, right? History is about looking at the whole. It's about looking at all of the evidence together. Farid is doing a very reductive view of history, right? And the other thing is, look, skepticism I'll address in a second, but even among Sunnis, right, they have this whole notion of probability. They have this whole notion of Bayesian inferences even within their own hadith. So for example, we have Nawawi writing on his commentary in Muslim. He says, look, when the meeting of two transmitters is established, cohesiveness in regards to any particular transmission is likely because the issue is based on likelihood, and we're satisfied with that. It's an important principle, even with Sahih narrations. Nawawi is saying, look, this is partly probabilistic. It's not so objective as Farid wants it to be. It's all probability. It's all probability. All of history, all of hadith. These are all holistic sciences. They're not so individual, nitty gritty, paying attention to the individual wording of one narration, of a narration that has 100 different variants. It's a silly way of looking at it, right? Let's look at this, for example, right? Even two Sahih hadith can contradict with each other, right? Two reports here deal with the Prophet's age. Both are from Ibn Abbas. Now, we have one narration saying that the Prophet stayed in Mecca for 13 years, and one says in 10 years. So what are we doing here? Are they both correct? Are they both incorrect? What happens? So there's many interpretations we can use to view these two hadiths and judge between them. One interpretation is, look, Aisha lied, Aisha lied and said he stayed for 10 years, and Ibn Abbas was correct, right? But obviously this is a stupid interpretation. Another interpretation is, look, a narrator made a mistake in the chain. That's a more reasonable interpretation. And another more reasonable interpretation is, look, we can say people didn't even keep track of ages so much back in the day. They were just like, okay, like 10, 15 years, 13, whatever, it's all the same number to me, right? That's another interpretation of history. These are all ways that we are looking into history and pulling things out beyond just what is written in the text. And we're always doing this. We're always looking at it this way. We can't avoid doing this. This is all subjective. This is all intuitive. And even look, a Sahih narration can even be wrong. So his postulate that we were talking about earlier, that a Sahih narration is correct, it's reliable, and a Da'if narration is necessarily less reliable, less correct. Look, we have a blatant anachronism. The Mi'raj happened after the Prophet became the Prophet. But here we have a narration in Bukhari from Anas saying the Mi'raj happened before the prophethood. This is a blatant anachronism. Everyone rejects this. And I was mentioning earlier that this whole view of being nitty gritty with narrations, focusing on just one narration at a time and looking at each individual wording. Look, even mutawatir hadith, like hadith al-thaqalain, hadith al-ghadir, they have alternate wordings to them, right? Even they can be faulted. What's the probability, for example, that the one narration from Ibn Abbas that is through this particular chain has the exact wording that was said by the Prophet? It's a very low probability, right? You have to look at things from the whole. You have to look at things from a zoomed out perspective. Don't fall into this trap that Farid wants to drag people into of, look, you need to prove it to be sahih. You need to prove it to be 100% rigorous and this and this and this and this and this. No, you have to look at things holistically. Use some common sense, some aql, right? And look, if Farid doesn't want to rely on this sahih narration here being wrong, he has to accept this idea that you need some aql, you need some non-textual evidence for the study of history. And of course, he even believes in this too, right? For example, when he's reconciling between two contradictory reports, what's his analysis?
And all of a sudden it was a battle. It wasn't something that was intended. Now what's the proof for this? This is something very interesting. Zayd bin Wahab, who was with Ali, he says the Basrans started the battle. Okay? Abd Khair, who was with who? Nope, he's also with Ali. He said Ali started the battle. You have two different people, both with Ali, contradicting each other in regards to who started the battle.
So look, right? Farid has many options here. He has many options here. Either A, he could have rejected one narration and accepted the other, or B, he could have reconciled between them. He chose option B, but why, right? There's no objective standard to say, look, you have to choose option B instead of option A. Instead, what he's saying is, look, the battle wasn't intentional. He has qarina, he has supporting evidence. And what's his supporting evidence? His supporting evidence is his narrative, his understanding of Sunni theology and doctrines, which says, look, the Sahaba would necessarily not, deliberately incite such violence like this. So, of course, he's coming from this background. Whether it's consciously or unconsciously, he's coming from this background. So he's going to be interpreting favorable to that background. But, on the other hand, when it comes to Shias, Farid says, no. You can't use your aql. You can't look at things interpretively. You can't look at things on the whole. And then, before we're accused of strawmanning Farid, this is literally what he believes.
Now, the thing is about history is that there are some views that you can hold, and there are some views that you simply cannot hold. Some views you're unjustified in holding. And this specific event, believing in this specific event, is something that's simply unjustified. There's no excuse for it. If Shi'is cannot prove this from their own books, then don't expect Sunnis to believe this.
Look, this is in response to his challenge, right? His famous, give me one Sahih narration from Shia books that is clear cut and this and this and this that proves that Umar killed Fatima, right? Give me one clear Sahih narration. His belief is Shias may only believe in something if and only if we have a Sahih report for it. But this is nonsense, right? This is completely nonsense. It's because even Farid himself, he says, look, when can we be lenient with historical reports? What does he say?
There are two things that we have to keep in mind in regards to the way we authenticate these historical reports and determine their authenticity. The first happens to be related to the level of weakness, and the second has to do with the report itself and what is the significance of the report.
So here we go, right? So what is he saying here? We can be lenient with history if the report is not that significant and if the level of weakness is not that much. Okay, the first standard I can accept, right? The first standard, if one of the narrators is a liar, if one of the narrators is completely disconnected, like 3 steps down, if there's like a huge gap in the narration, sure, I can accept that, that matters quite a bit. But the second thing, how significant a report is, this is entirely a subjective matter. This is completely subjective. There's no excuse to say that it's objective at all, right?
There are two things that we have to...
So, for example, in this clip here, he's talking about Umar, right? He's saying like this important figure, quote unquote. This is his innuendo for Umar, right?
So let's say, for example, if you have a major historical figure who's portrayed in a very negative light, and that historical figure is hated by a political faction or a religious sect,
i.e. the Shia,
then, what if you have an anonymous narrator in the chain, or if you have a disconnected report? Naturally, you would assume that perhaps maybe that anonymous narrator fabricated this report in order to make this historical figure look.
So look, his implied claim here is, look, Umar is a major historical figure, and the Shias have motivations to fabricate against him to look bad. Okay, this is implication here, and we know from his previous statement that, look, we should weigh how important a report is and be strict or less strict based on that. So for him, with Umar, we should be very strict about it, right? Why? Because apparently there's some motivation for Shias to fabricate this. So he mentions this criteria of importance, but the only reason why he would consider this event important is because it has consequences against Adalat as-Sahaba, which is a doctrine he cannot prove objectively, right? He can't even prove Adalat as-Sahaba objectively, and the only reason why he considers this event important is because he presumes this in the first place. He has this assumption. We have a clip here from Sheikh Umar Ramadan.
Now, the incident, and one thing I mentioned in my paper, which I want to mention clearly, is that if this incident, I'm first of all against this incident, but if this incident did actually take place, it rightly deserves condemnation of Umar radiallahu anhu. If this incident did take place, if he did actually do what he's accused of, it definitely does deserve condemnation, defaming his character.
Look, so, obviously this is a bad event for Sunnis, but for anyone else, for a Shia, for a non-Muslim, it's fine, right? This is not that significant for us. Because for a Shia, we're looking at this as Umar is acting like Umar, Umar, the guy who throws rocks at black kids in the masjid, he's acting like Umar, right? To a non-Muslim historian, he's like, okay, Umar was a hot-tempered person. This is part of his character to have gone out and, been aggressive towards Fatima alayhi salam, right? So, Farid even mentions, look, one possible motivation for why the Fatimiyyah could be fabricated is to make Umar look bad, right? Well, why can't we apply that same standard to Ibn Umar, for example, saying, look, the best of the nation after me is Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, and we used to not differentiate between the Sahaba. You mean excluding Ali, for example, right? Why isn't this, for example, a fabrication? Why can't we say that this has motivation to be to legitimize Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, especially considering, look, don't, like, the winners of the side of history write history. Don't they control the narrative? So why shouldn't we be skeptical of them, right? This is all very subjective. There's none of this objectivity to this as he's trying to claim here. And I have a quote here from Asma Afsaruddin, and she says, a close inspection of some of the manaqib literatures, the hadith collections that collect the fada'il of the Sahaba, in particular on Abu Bakr and Ali, reveals certain ideological thrusts behind their formulations that help better understand the trajectory of early history of the disputes over leadership of the Muslims. Right? Very clearly, in Sunni books themselves, and I've discussed this in previous lectures, for example, that look, there's two distinct strands of these historical narratives, right? There's one strand of narrative that says Ali was the best of the companions, Ali was the bravest, Ali was the first person to convert, Ali had the most knowledge, and on the other hand, we have another strand of narration that says, look, Abu Bakr and Umar were created from the sands of paradise. Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman did this. Abu Bakr picked up the big bucket in the Prophet's dream, and Umar picked up the bigger one, Uthman picked up the little one, and then Ali stumbled. We have these narrations in Sunni books. There's two clear, distinct strands here, and people are creating their narratives, their visions, their historical reports. They're formulating them around these two strands. So where is the objectivity of one over the other, right? In order to criticize one, you have to presume the other, right? You can't just simply sit outside of them entirely. And look, right, as I was explaining, we have other qarina, we have other textual indicators to suggest, the event of Fatimiyyah is more in line with Umar's nature. And Sunnis themselves are proud of Umar's nature as being a hot-tempered person. So, like, for example, we have this report here where some Ethiopians were playing in the masjid. The Prophet was fine with it. He was just relaxing. And Umar took a stone and threw it at them, We even have in reports in Tabari, in Bukhari, for example, where Sa'ad ibn Ubadah and Umar got into a scuffle at Saqifa. What's so far-fetched to say that, Umar got into a scuffle with Talha or Zubair at Fatima alayhi salam's house? What's so far-fetched about that? The idea is, look, we should be building a narrative. We should be building a coherent story, a coherent set of ideas that takes into account as many facts as possible. Don't build up a single moment, right? Farid's looking at this too much in a microscope. He's not looking at this as a holistic perspective. He's not looking at the big picture here, right? He's rejecting this. Why? Because he has all these subjective presumptions about the importance of this event. He's rejecting it because he has a subjective assumption about Adalat the Sahaba. He's rejecting it because he has this subjective view of the mursal of Aslam, which he rejects for his own reasons, right? This is all subjective. None of this is his own objective understanding of any of this. So I guess, with that, we should end with the following words from Farid. And perhaps now they won't sound so, I guess, pompous or scary anymore. And maybe this clip will sound a bit ironic now.
The authentic reports say this. Ya akhi, wallah, most people, they'll say this, they don't even know what they're saying. They don't know what they're quoting. Everyone's appealing to his view of history. And what's his view? Whatever suits his beliefs.
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself, Farid. Whatever suits your beliefs, you believe in it. So with that being said, thank you all. Thank you all for attending. And I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope that was educational. I hope I was clear in whatever I said. And with that being said, I'd like to open up for any questions anyone has. You can type in VC text or you can just open up your mic.
صل على محمد وآل محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
اللهم صل على محمد بارك الله فيك أخي Aldun. That was beautiful, man. That was good.
I hope I delivered on my promises.
No, dude, that was way more than I expected. I was not expecting all that. That was good, mashallah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to actually add something.
Sure.
Rather than asking a question. And there's Sahih narrations of Umar beating multiple women. For example, instead of just pointing to the scuffle at Saqifa bin Sa'ida, there's narrations where after Abu Bakr died, his daughters were mourning for him, and he goes into the house and he pulls one of his daughters, Abu Bakr's daughters, out of the house and starts lashing her publicly for mourning for Abu Bakr. Then you have another hadith where he's beating his wife in the middle of the night, and then somebody sees him and he basically says, "Don't worry, I heard the Prophet say, peace be upon him, say, a man should not be asked why he beats his wife." This isn't so yeah, these are other like things you can point at to like see his hot temperness, and that he used to beat women very often, including his own wives and the daughters of Abu Bakr. Okay. Yep.
See,
I mean, you know the
exactly
story of his conversion, right? Like that itself is like something the Sunnis are very proud of and repeat. That when his sister converted to Islam, he, went to her house and beat her up, and then he went to go and kill the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and there he was stopped and converted.
Yeah, and this is actually but these two stories I mentioned were post conversion, right?
Yeah,
this was
it's just a trend throughout his life, like of
yeah. So yeah, okay.
Oh, Sam had a question. I'm just gonna explain what Daniel just responded. Sam said, "Can one be da'if in history but sahih in can da'if in hadith but sahih in history?" Yeah, we have for example, Abu Miqnaf is da'if in hadith but sahih in history. Also, by the way, I forgot to acknowledge people in this presentation. First of all, I want to say thank you to Silverado. His library was indispensable. He helped me with this presentation as well. I want to thank Mr. Jed, Mr. Lenient. Both of them helped me with this presentation. I want to thank everyone else who was involved in this, and everyone who came here. They were all indispensable resources for this presentation. So I just want to acknowledge them up front. But yeah, thank you guys. Any other questions or comments?
Somebody said they
I have a comment about oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, wait, someone said they had a
the flower girl.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's up?
You mentioned that the attack and why Farid rejects the attack is because of subjective views that label as a good person, as a pious, but you that why is also due to a subjective thing. But then how can one take a position? This is accepted due to a subjective view, and if Farid, for example, in his video, labeled all the narrations presented as daif.
Okay, so if I understand your question correctly, you're saying both Sunni and Shia views are subjective as to what the truth of the event was. And so how can we take a position? Is that a correct understanding of your question?
No, I accept, but I mean what that if we say that his views are subjective, our acceptance in his rejection or due subjectivism. For example, there are few Shia scholars who reject the attack, for example, and he highly criticizes view.
Excuse me, who? Sorry, you cut out.
The scholar. Kamal Haydari.
Oh, Kamal Haydari. Yeah, okay.
Yes, and the Sunni defense took advantage of his position, and he said, "Look, your point of view, your view of world is completely subjective. You want to take this this fable and take as an universal, and all these reports are weak, and your viewer is subject. So I ask, how you would to them?
How do you, excuse me, what?
How can we reach to them? Because we say that their views are subject, they say that our views are subject.
Okay, so first and foremost, I'm having trouble understanding the question, but I'm gonna try to piece together what I understand. Number one, first and foremost, no Shia rejects the attack categorically, right? So, for example, we have Sayyid Fadlullah, we have Khui, both of them rejecting specific details about the event. So, for example, Fadlullah denies that the kicking of the door happened. Kamal al-Haydari denies that the event of the door, Muhsin, happened. Muhsin existed. But neither of them deny that an altercation, some sort of violence between Umar and Fatima took place. None of them deny this. No Shia scholar denies this. This is agreed upon within the sect. However, the details, was there a baby named Muhsin? Was there a door in the first place? Did Umar hit her with the hilt of a sword? Did Qunfuz whip her or something? Did etc., etc., etc. All these sorts of these details, these are disagreed upon. What's agreed upon is the event. We all agree upon this. These are all details people disagree upon. And again, these details are similar to Ashura, right? We know what happened in Ashura, right? Imam Hussein died. Of course, he was martyred. But the details of this, how many arrows he got shot with, or what did Shimr do? Did he do this or did he do that? How did Imam Hussein talk to the army of Yazid? How did Hur come to this and this and this? These are all disagreed upon, but we know what happened generally. We know generally what happened. This is the same kind of idea. This is the same kind of details. Anyone else?
Can you hear me?
Was I can hear you.
But my question that I don't know if I was here. It's because I want how should I respond, because they say that our views are subject because we want to condemn Umar. We want to say, oh look, they stole the Imam alayhi salam, and the Sunnis respect him, they love him. They say this is their subjective reason. They say that we are also have our subjective reasons to accept the event. They have reasons to reject.
Okay, look, so as I mentioned before, right? These narrations don't come out of nowhere, right? There's a common historical memory. Like people contemporary, 20 years later, 50 years later, 100 years later, there's just a common understanding in the social circles that these sorts of events existed, right? We have, for example, the works of Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, which is an early source which indicates that this happened. And now this didn't come out of nowhere. It has to have come from some sort of some people were believing in it. Some people were coming up with this. Now the question is, did the Shia make this up to make Umar look bad, right? Did they invent this to make Umar look bad? The thing is, we can just as easily turn the question around on them for any number of things. For example, as I was mentioning in this presentation, this whole notion of Adalat as-Sahaba, it's all subjective, right? This is their whole understanding and subjectivity of this. And as I explained before, one could easily argue that Ibn Umar and all these other Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman narrations are in their praises and their specific things. We can just as easily argue that, look, this is all subjective on them as well. The reality of it is that we can't run away from we can't run away from subjectivity altogether. And secondly, we can't run away from there being a little bit of doubt in anything, right? There's always going to be a little bit of doubt. There's always going to be a little bit of uncertainty. But the question is the degree of what uncertainty, meaning like how uncertain we are about an event, as opposed to are we absolutely uncertain. I don't know if that answers the question or not. If you have any follow-ups,
Yeah.
I would. Oh, okay. If you have any follow-up, I'd request that you ask in VC text so other people can ask as well.
Hey, I have wait, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I have a comment, but yeah, I also to what the sister was saying. Yeah, at the end of the day, I feel like Brother Musa was not trying to say, "Oh, you're subjective and we're objective." At the end of the day, whether you're Sunni or Shia, it's all subjective.
Right,
it
exactly.
Just comes down to like the usul.
It's all
the
subjective.
foundations. It's if you imam it or not.
Mm-hmm. It's all subjective. Everything is a little bit subjective. Everything's a little bit uncertain. The question is what your bases are, what your assumptions about the world are, and based on those assumptions about the world, you can come up with certain beliefs or not, right? Everything is just going to be based on a little bit of uncertainty. There's always going to be a little bit of skepticism involved. You're never going to be 100% certain and 100% clear about anything.
Yeah, 100%. At the end of the day, both Sunni and Shia is subjective. So I just want to.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I'm gonna be quick. Was during your lecture, I was playing a little bit of devil's advocate and trying to think like Farid. How would Farid respond to some of these things? I think in one part where you're talking about the subjectivity of the Rafida the gradings, I think there are a good amount of scholars who try to be unbiased and be like, okay, let's just look at the types of hadith he narrates and not really what his beliefs are, because at the end of the day, it's really based on trustworthiness. Like Albani, for example, he's known as very unbiased in this regard, as unbiased as you can be as a Salafi. But even that is has its own catch to it, because what is like an accepted narration? He could, what is actually not portraying his beliefs? Because he could be truthful and talk about the burning door, and Albani is an unbiased muhaqqiq might be like, oh, he's displaying his innovations right now,
Right.
Yeah.
That's definitely the case. Because of course, there are of course prominent Shia narrators who are in Al-Kafi, who are praised in Kashi, who are praised in our books of Rijal. Like for example, Abdul Malik bin A'yan, the brother of Zurara, radiallahu ta'ala. And for example, we have the narrator Aban bin Taghlib. Both of these are found in Bukhari. Both of these are found in Muslim. They're prominent Sunni books. However, the question is not necessarily do they accept Shia narrators? Do they accept Rafidi narrators? The question is more so, how are they accepting these people? What is their standard? And their standard is all over the place. They don't have a consistent standard to say, look, I want to reject a Rafidi here, and I want to reject a Rafidi not here, for example. People even disagree as to, should I accept these narrations from these people? Should I not accept these narrations from these people? The question is, how am I going to arbitrate between these opinions? Which one am I selecting? This is a subjective standard. You can't run away from it being subjective. And as much as Farid wants to claim it's objective and certain, he can't, because it's ultimately a matter of you deciding between these opinions.
Yeah.
Can you guys?
You just cut out, by the way. You cut out if you were saying.
Sorry, 1 second. 1 second. Can you guys hear me now?
I can. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I just wanted to add something. I remember. If you guys remember, I gave a lecture a few weeks ago about their inconsistencies and how they'll weaken one chain. First of all, we all know that this Aslam chain is absolutely authentic. I mean, besides Bukhari, even Muslim relied on the mursal of Aslam. There's hadiths in Muslim. There's one hadith in Muslim where he narrates a story. Aslam narrates a story about Umar and the Prophet, peace be upon him, right? So I just want to say that even with this story of there's even other narrations in their books in regards to this. This Musannaf is not really the only one, There's even a narration. This is in. I'll just quote Ibn Kathir, right? He quotes Ibn Kathir. Ibn Kathir says that there was that Muhammad bin they went with Umar. They were with Umar and they broke the sword of Zubayr on the day of the allegiance, right? And this is in reference to obviously the altar, like where was Zubayr at the time, right? Like no one's gonna dispute where he was. This was during there was an altercation at the house, even Kathir, and he says at the end of this that this narration is Jayyid, like the Sanad is Jayyid, right? So again, this like Farid talking about this Aslam narration is just another example of how they will like write like 1,000 articles about one chain, and it's like, okay, great, you can have that one. You know, there's other ones too.
Right.
So I just want to add that.
Right.
Yeah.
That's 100% right. This whole idea of like one Sahih narration, it's just a game that they're playing. It's a red herring. Don't get dragged into it. It's exactly the point you're making. It's like, I 100% agree. We should be looking at things holistically, big picture, using your brain. Don't look at things like an idiotic Salafi that, like, you know, one narration, you have to pick apart each individual word and then cope about individual words and then cope about 10 different narrations in 10 different ways. No, it's stupid.
Mm-hmm.
There's some questions in VC text.
Oh, let me check. Sorry. Thank you. Okay, let's check this out. That's my question. The report has been falsely attributed to Sahih Muslim. It isn't there. It has been falsely attributed to Ibn Athir. Ibn Athir doesn't quote it. It has been approved Abu Ishaq al-Handani. This video Farid rejecting Islamic miracle because he believes it's a fabrication, even though it's not negative to Islam. How can this compare to his rejection of the attack of Fatima? I don't know too much about that, Ali Mehdi. I'll look into it later, but I will let you know. And Sheikh Raichu, yes, I will share my Google Slides presentation. Like I can't tell you what his reasons are for rejecting that narration. I can't tell you what that narration is because I haven't even seen this video. But I'll take a look at it later and I'll talk to you. So with that, any other questions?
Yeah. I had something cool that I read. Actually, they even like Al-Darimi in his Sunan reports that they regarding the Basran scholar Abu al-Aliya Rufay ibn Mihran, that he would follow people who he wanted to narrate from to observe him when he prayed, and if he knew how to perform the prayer, then they would sit down with him and say he must be correct in other matters. But if he performed the prayer incorrectly, we would move away from him and say he's wrong in other matters. So they would weaken somebody based on the way he prayed. I mean, that's coming with the preconceived notion, obviously, that your way of praying is the correct way of praying. So, for example, if they saw somebody praying like a Shia, that would automatically make them weak in their eyes.
Yeah, even Dr. Brown talks about this in his How We Know Hadith Critics Did Matan Criticism. Sahih in Muslim, his commentary of Muslim, Muslim explicitly says, he rejects a narration because it conflicts with his practices. He rejects a narration of wudu because he doesn't do wudu that way. So it's exactly as you're saying, you're presupposing it. But yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed. It seems like, judging by the reception, that I should be posting this to YouTube. And hopefully Gangu Teli, will respond to this, and we'll see. Inshallah. Alright, thank you guys for attending. I gotta go pray soon, and I gotta go, but thank you all for attending, really. I really appreciated the warm welcome and the large attendance, alhamdulillah. So, thank you all. And awesome discussion, too. Thank you.